we'll be introducing a wonderful colleague who does not really need an introduction. Eva Horn is here with us, and I will very, very quickly introduce her, although again, she would probably need about 10 or 15 minutes of an introduction. But the most important things, she is a colleague from the German department. She's professor of modern German literature at the University of Vienna, with specializations, among others, in literature and political theory, as well as disaster imagination in modern literature and film, cultural conceptions of climate, and of course, the Anthropocene. A number of her books have been published. I'm just mentioning here a couple of them. She's, of course, the author of The Secret War, Treason, Espionage, and Modern Fiction, that went or came out with Northwestern University Press. Then The Future as Catastrophe from the Columbia University Press, 2018, and recently, together with Hannes Bergthaler, The Anthropocene: Key Issues for the Humanities, and that's with Routledge, 2019. She has received numerous accolades, prizes, and among them, she was distinguished Max Kade visiting professor at the NYU. And then last year, she received this wonderful Heinrich Mann essay prize for her work on the future, or the essay, The Future as Catastrophe. We know her also as the founder of the Vienna Anthropocene Network, and as a colleague who's incredibly creative, exciting, and very thoughtful. So I'm very much opening the floor to you, Eva. Thank you for joining us today. And Eva will be talking about tipping points, COVID, and the Anthropocene.
Yes, my talk will be very basic and kind of an explanatory footnote to Sophia's talk, which raised many, many questions. I will just talk about two things that are in my title: COVID-19 pandemic and the Anthropocene. Monika mentioned it. I've written a book on the Anthropocene, so I'll give you just like the minimum outline of what's in the book, even though I suppose that as you're all familiar with the term, my approach, you will see, is very much oriented on what the sciences have to say about the Anthropocene. And from there, then I draw my conclusions as a humanities scholar, but you will not see much of that. You will not hear anything about German literature. You will not hear anything about literature and fiction at all. It's mainly an epistemic analysis of the commonalities or the relations between the pandemic and the Anthropocene. So let's start with my first slide. What is that relationship? There has been a lot of suggestions. What is the exact relation between, how can the Anthropocene be seen as a cause or as a background of the Anthropocene, of the pandemic? And one of the reasons was, of course, mentioning the possibility of zoonosis by shrinking natural habitats for many species, and thereby having more and more viral exchange between humans and non-human animals in this case. The other one has to do with, of course, factors such as global mobility, global networks of commodities or supply chains. That would be all contributing to the very way in which the pandemic played out, spread so quickly in comparison to the flu pandemic of 1918-19. This one was insanely fast. And this has something to do with the globalized world, which is part of the Anthropocene diagnosis. On the other hand, we also have kind of a disruption of the dynamics of ecological crisis by the disruption of traffic and industry. We saw clear skies over Beijing and New Delhi, which haven't been seen for the past 25 years. And so there was also kind of a disruption of the Anthropocene crisis in a certain way. Digitalization took a big leap forward. We will probably see a reduction of a long-term reduction of commuter traffic and traveling. Hopefully, something good will come out of the pandemic and the experiences we made of it. I think digitalization, the way we talk to each other now by Zoom, may also have a positive environmental effect. So COVID has been called a symptom of the Anthropocene in a somewhat gleeful or schadenfreude type of way. By Bruno Latour, it has been called a dress rehearsal for the great environmental collapse, an experimental space for learning how to deal with things differently. Sorry, I don't fully see my own presentation. Do you still have the presentation mode? Because I don't. I'm not sure what.
Yes, we do. We do actually. But now we don't.
Okay. Now you don't.
Now we don't.
I do. I do.
Oh, okay. I don't.
Okay.
Anyone else?
Somebody is going through my slides. Okay. Of course, a break as kind of disruption also of deleterious processes of the Anthropocene. COVID has been named a result. What I would like to aim for is, in fact, seeing a COVID as a model that has epistemic analogies to the Anthropocene, and from which, COVID as a model from which we can draw certain conclusions for the Anthropocene and for environmental policy, but also for foresight, risk management, and so on in the Anthropocene, or in the problems we are facing with the Anthropocene. So what is the Anthropocene? You're probably going to be bored to death, but nevertheless, I would like to sharpen the term, because I feel that very often in the humanities, it's very often used in a very broad brush manner. And I think, and that's on a methodological note, as humanities scholars in the Anthropocene, we need to take, we need to understand and really embrace what the scientists have to say about this ecological crisis called the Anthropocene. So first of all, it's a new chronological epoch marking the end of the Holocene. I will not go deeply into that. You've all read the articles by Stefan Krutzen and the like. There's a new book by Jan Zalajevic, edited by Jan Zalajevic, that describes this geochronological findings in a very, very broad way. Secondly, it's an ecological meta-crisis made of many dimensions and changing baselines. I will give you one slide regarding that. And thirdly, as for the historical beginning of the Anthropocene, the suggestion of the Anthropocene Working Group is to nail the beginning at the Great Acceleration, meaning kind of post-war, post-World War II period with, whenever I even look at my mouse, the slides go. With an escalating dynamics of parallel ecological disruption or crisis parameters and socioeconomic growth. It also marks the beginning, just as a footnote, of oil as a moving from being oil as a very dense energy source, as a rather specialized energy source, into a ubiquitous material and a ubiquitous fuel consumed in huge quantities. Okay. That is the one referring to point 2, ecological meta-crisis. Maybe you have seen this picture or this, I don't know what it is, but it seems to jump a little bit more than I'd like to. You've seen this, it's the famous graphic of Rockström's research group on planetary boundaries. I will not talk too much about the boundary concept, but I would like to point you to the very many different dimensions of the Anthropocene as a meta crisis. It's made out of an insane amount of different specific sub-crises, of one of which climate change, but that's not the only. The most intriguing thing on this picture I find is the novel entities, meaning we may not even know all the dimensions that are currently in crisis. Secondly, the Anthropocene as a threshold, pointing to the great acceleration. And you will see in the course of my talk, I will talk a lot about graphs and curves and the bend in a curve. What you see here are socioeconomic factors, population growth, foreign direct investment, GDP growth, energy use, water use, paper production, and the like. Socioeconomic trends ranging from the mid of the 18th century to 2000, and you see this sharp bend or escalation around 1950. In parallel with the blue graphs that mark Earth system trends or accumulation of greenhouse gases, land use, aquaculture, ocean acidification, and the like. The gist of these two graphs, of this superposition of the two graphs, is of course to show how these things temporarily work in common in a common pace, and how the escalation really starts in the post-war period and is escalating even further. However, escalation sounds catastrophic and so on. This is a term I used or overused in my book on catastrophe. Monika mentioned it. I call that a catastrophe without event. Normally we have a big bang, a sudden disruption. Certainly COVID-19 is such a, if you want to call it a catastrophe, it's a catastrophe as an evolving event, but it's fast enough to be seen as an event. What we have with the Anthropocene are incremental changes or changing baselines. If we do not see a species anymore, or if, say, my grandparents were used to seeing a species or were used to a certain weather pattern, and I'm not anymore, that's what you call a changing baseline. So in a certain way, humans are too short-lived to really observe these, and they are also oblivious to really be aware that they are living in a world whose basic parameters, such as weather patterns, such as species that you can see or emerging species, that this is rapidly changing. So we have, in this type of catastrophe, incremental catastrophe, a certain amount of imperceptibility or latency. Latency meaning something is going on, but below a threshold of attention and knowledge. We need scientists to come up with big computer models to point this out to a larger public, and then it's still, we don't believe in it. So the perception always comes in a certain way too late. We also are dealing with highly interconnected processes. Talking about entanglement, it's not just entanglement between human and non-humans, it's the entanglement between many different non-human things that we would wish for they weren't so entangled, such as different factors in the climate system and so on. And lastly, what is the gist of my talk, tipping points, meaning processes that go through this period of latency and you don't see anything, and all of a sudden you have this bend and you have a non-linear excursion or escalation of a process. Okay, one of which is just the temperature rise. You can see that there was a certain period of stabilization, and then around the 70s you see this bend with an escalating dynamics. Now it's going faster and faster. And one thing maybe about this temperature curve is that, you know, it's greenhouse gases, it's mainly CO2. The point is, and you may have read about it, the oceans absorb a huge amount of the heat and also a huge amount of the CO2. However, only up to a certain saturation point. And what scientists tell us now, that we are nearing this saturation point. So this curve, which looks dramatic enough to me, is probably going faster upward once the saturation point of the oceans has been reached. This is a recent paper by Timothy Lenton, an Earth system scientist, who just points out different crises and their causal interconnection. Yeah, I will not go deeply into that, but basically you see that one crisis doesn't come alone. We know it about melting polar ice shields. That has a lot of consequence. We know it about the acidification of the oceans. The oceans are a buffer that keeps the system stable, but if they go haywire, we're lost, right? So that these buffer systems are prone to what Earth system scientists describe as tipping points, as moments when a system is saturated and you cannot stop the process anymore. You should have done this during the latency period. Think just one example. Think about the melting point of ice. Ice as a solid or a very viscous fluid, depending on how you describe it, it's very solid and it doesn't budge during a range of 100 degrees, going from minus 100 to -1 degrees Celsius. And then you have a range of 4 degrees and bam, it completely changes its state. It's going from ice to water. So that is a way in which scientists have tried to visualize the instability of the path the Earth system is taking. Now we're right here, and maybe we managed to get in a more stable yet risky position, or we're just rolling down that valley into the hothouse Earth. So what have the Earth system and its crisis, dubbed the Anthropocene, and the COVID pandemic have to do with one another? It's clear that COVID-19 taught us a lot of lessons about tipping points. And in a certain way, even if you have experienced tipping points, you might not be sharp enough to anticipate the next tipping point. We had this phenomenon last summer. What you see here is the global cases. You have a relatively shallow curve, however, going through valleys and mountains. A tipping point would be exactly this here. A tipping point, of course, is also when all of a sudden you have a sharp drop. And of course, here's another tipping point, yeah? So you have escalating developments. You see it much clearer in the Austrian case curve, tipping point here, then lockdown, flat, flat, flat. And now this is the tipping point, right? And then here you have an even faster tipping point. So at the moment when a development tips, you don't even realize this is the event. That's what I call a catastrophe without an event. You don't realize that this is an event. Okay, now, yeah, this is an earlier curve I made for a talk in, I think, November. That's why, in November, that's why it stops in November. I just tried to pinpoint these tipping points. Now let me go to my conclusion. I can't see the clock. Wait. Oh yeah, I'm almost in. Okay, last minute and I'll give you my conclusions. So basically what I'm trying to tell you, or to point out is COVID-19 is in a certain way a catastrophe without an event, but on speed. So this is why we can perceive it as an event or an event-shaped crisis of which we don't even know whether we are in the middle or in the beginning or at the end of it, right? So what could be the lessons drawn from our experiences in the COVID-19 crisis for the Anthropocene, which is a much more protracted crisis with a totally different temporality? First of all, understand tipping points and understand the treacherous nature of latency periods. In the latency period, everything is preparing, is cooking up, but you can't see it. So understand the pitfalls of latency. Try, that's a lesson from the philosopher Hans Jonas, try to put yourself in the position of a future that looks back onto the present as its past. So look from the future back to the now and say, what did I miss then? What should I have anticipated? That is thinking about latency. It's a very complex process, and it's not just probabilistic at all. It's very often much more scenario planning, which has a lot to do with fiction, with coming up with stories. And if this, then what? The precautionary principle, you know it from the social sciences. It means to be ultra cautious in implementing certain technologies, using certain substances, and so on. But if we use it as a political principle, it would mean prepare for the worst, or expect the worst, prepare for it, and expect or take into account that you don't know everything yet. It's the famous unknown unknowns that Donald Rumsfeld talked about, but he has a point. The biggest problem in prevention, precaution, preparing, planning is what you cannot really know that you have a blind spot on. So trying to think about our blind spot, that's why I believe fiction is important, because we need to employ our imagination. Thirdly, understand entanglement and interdependency. You've seen the slides, whatever. You think of supply chains, think of climate change, think of whatever you want. Everything is interconnected, but don't use that as a buzzword. Understand the nature of the network you're trying to show. It's not just saying everything is connected, like, it's really about understanding if this happens, then that will follow, and this will influence a third factor, and so on. So it's really a very precise understanding of entanglement and interdependency. One point one lesson that I personally learned is, please believe in science, or please believe in research. We're having now the surge of anti-vaxxers. I just had a lady here helping me with my household, and she's not vaccinated because she believes that the vaccine is more dangerous than the getting corona, and she's 65. Not a good idea. I tried what I could, but think about how scientists were used during the COVID crisis. They were used to, yes, to give advice, but also to always say what the government wanted to hear. And sometimes their advice was not heard, and sometimes it was an overreaction to some suggestion. So I think we also need to develop a different way of dealing with research and understanding what science really is. Lastly, embrace contingency. We have all learned lessons about the non-plannable future, about our own plans falling through, but that can also be an opening, a sign of hope, or a reason for hope. Everything could be different. We could just not drive around and rush from one talk to the next, but have this type of meeting here and not use too much or have too much CO2 emissions. So for me, it was really a hopeful period of seeing that many things can be done differently. So that's the end of my talk. One last vanity thing. It's just pointing you to two things that I'm doing on behalf of this topic. One is my book with Hannes Bergthaler, and the other one is the Vienna Anthropocene Network. I wasn't really sure whether Monika would put an emphasis on this, so that's it. So thank you very much for your patience.